Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. I've got a couple of cool cases from Cougar. Sounds like the beginning of a tongue twister, but it's not. If you've never seen a case from Cougar, prepare to be impressed. I've got the DarkBlader-G and the Blazer. I'll be reviewing these separately, so let's start and get at least one of them out of the box. This is the DarkBlader-G, still in the box. Oh, what the heck, I'll give you a sneak peek. There's what it looks like. And we're back to the box. Alright, so on the side here it talks about distinctive style with elegant design. There's a brushed aluminum front panel. Enjoy the dazzling RGB show. Let's see, it works with compatible motherboards, 5-volt connection for system-wide lighting synchronization, massive visibility. In case standard visibility isn't enough, you get massive visibility with a full tempered glass panel. Ultimate cable management, top-notch gaming hardware, so you know that you can't go any higher than the top notch. eATX support, that's good. That's an extended ATX, so it's a slightly larger than standard motherboard, so this is supported. Now, I initially thought this was a mid-tower case. This is actually a full-tower case, so eATX support is really not that surprising in a full tower. Mid tower, it's a little harder to find. And we've got superior cooling. Let's see, up to 360 millimeter radiator is supported and 7 fans. So those are some of the goodies on the side that are listed. And now it's time to crack open the box. Oh boy, I'll tell you, I should have known this was a full tower because this thing is really heavy. A little bit of a struggle getting it out of the box, and I can tell you right now, I am not going to put it back in the box. But it is packed quite well. We got all this foam that's cut with a nice contour to fit the shape of the case. It's in this nice fabric bag. They did a nice job of protecting it. It was actually on its side here a moment ago. I didn't realize it, so I had to flip it up. So I haven't had the bag off yet, so you get to see it at the same time I do. And there it is. And of course, it's backwards. So let's see here. That's interesting. We actually have glass all the way around. I didn't realize that. I thought it was just glass on the one side. Boy, that thing is really heavy. Very solid. Okay, now you can see it. Big and heavy enough. I got out my little homemade turntable there. I actually made this out of an old glass top for a TV stand that I never used, and I got a thrust bearing on there and a piece of PVC pipe to center it. So I made my own little custom turntable. Let me get that thing on there. And then I can just slide it like that. And that's a lot easier to move around. And now it's time for the first impression. Looking at it from the front, it has a very nice brushed aluminum finish. I really like that. It's sort of a very dark, it's silver, but it's more of a really dark gray finish to it. It's very, very consistent, very nice. I don't see any blemishes or any imperfections in it at all. Now all of the glass, I have to peel all this off. All the glass has this protective plastic on it, and I'll get that off here in a moment. Looks like the power and reset button, a couple of USB ports, microphone and headphone jacks, and it looks like they're surrounded with a plastic trim that, well, of course you can see in the picture there, they light up with LED lighting there. But that's got a full glass side panel. You can't add any more glass because it is completely full. On the back, there's a pretty generously vented section for the rear exhaust fan. We've got a couple of vertical slots there for a vertical GPU if you wanted to mount one that way. And it looks like this is slotted for your fan, your exhaust fan, to be able to shift up and down if you need to. Now I like this on top. We've got these two thumb screws here that allow you to take the top panel off And there is a, yes, these filter panel with a magnet around the perimeter. And there's the top. So we have all these slots to mount our different fans across the top there. And I can just pop that filter back in there. And I like that the fasteners are retained, so when you loosen them up, they don't fall and you have to chase them around the floor. And this is what I find interesting. This is the back glass. Usually this is just a regular metal panel. And I understand what they were talking about by the cable management, that little paragraph on the side of the box. Usually you're not terribly concerned about the cable management because it's all stuffed back here behind the motherboard tray and it's sort of out of sight. And it looks a little foggy there again because it's got this protective plastic. I'll get that off. And you can see it's already done its job because there's a pretty good scratch there in the plastic. So that's why they put that on there. But anyway, there's this large panel here, this section. My camera lighting keeps adjusting on me there. But anyway, that is where you can stuff all of your cables, since your cable management is going to be a little more visible on the back half. There is a very large open area here to draw air in, and the same thing down here. So it looks like you can get plenty of fresh air in from the front fans, because this side is pretty much blocked off with the glass panel there. So really all of your fresh air will be drawn in from the top and that bottom section there. You can kind of see all the way through it there a little bit. And this is the bottom of the case. You can see it has 4 large rubber pads there to keep the case from sliding around on the floor or scratching the floor. Also isolate any vibrations. There's a huge full-length filter panel for the bottom. Now it slides out from the side. So you could actually get that out without flipping the whole case over, but that sort of slides out that way. And then it's detented, so you got to kind of push it in. Of course, I'm doing this with one hand, so it's a little trickier. So anyway, that panel pops back in there. So now we'll get the side panels off. Well, I have to admit, it took me a couple minutes to figure out how to get the side panels off, because if you look, there are no fasteners at any of the corners. It's completely flush. So the way they do it, and this is pretty clever, you actually take this top panel off that I had off before. That just slides out of the way. And then the glass actually, and it really takes 2 hands, so I'll show you. I don't want to do that with one hand. So I'll go ahead and use 2. But the glass actually, you raise it up and you drop it down to return it. So there, you raise it up to get it out, or you sort of line it up and drop it down. Either way, you really need to use 2 hands with that. But on the back side of the glass, it's got these little little pins. Looks like there's 6 of them, 3 down each side. And it has a nice smoked, it is kind of a smoked glass there. Sort of a light smoke, it's not real dark. But those pins line up with these little, almost like little key slots. And that's what holds it on. It's the same on the back panel too. And now I can move in a little closer. Now, one thing I do want to point out is it does not come with any front fans. You can put your own. You can get either 3 140s or 3 120 millimeter fans in there. It does come with one rear 120 millimeter exhaust fan. It is a 3-pin fan. Now, if you look back at the picture here, you might be inclined to think it comes with an RGB fan, but it does specify on the web page that that is an option. You have to put your own RGB fan in there if you want. But looking inside a little more, something that stands out right away is we've got this pump bracket here. So if you're going to do liquid cooling and your own custom loop and you need somewhere to mount your pump, you have a nice removable pump base there. And then there's this little device here that is to support extra long, extra heavy graphics cards. And then you have this nice, it's like a little shroud there to help cover some of your cables also. Looking at the bottom power supply shroud, there are a couple of really nice openings there to fish cables up to the bottom I/O of the motherboard, as well as some openings here to get cables through. I like that. The shroud is not vented, so you'll want to mount your power supply most likely with the fan down to draw fresh air in from the underside of the case. Looking at the top, now this is also impressive. And again, this is a full tower, so you'd expect to have a fair amount of room. But if you look, these standoffs, this is where the top of your motherboard would be, roughly in this area. And there's a very generous amount of space. In fact, I'll just measure that real quick here. To the very top of the motherboard where it's touching, it looks like it's close to 65 millimeters. Now the motherboard's going to overlap a little bit past that, so it might be closer to 60 millimeters, but that's a fair amount of distance. You've got plenty of room for a radiator and fans up there. There's also a very nice opening right here to fish the power cables through for your CPU connections on the motherboard. A lot of times that's so tight. If you forget to connect that and you have a large air cooler, you just about have to pull the cooler off to get that cable connected. And there's also a fairly large cutout here to allow space for a front full-size radiator and fans. And then along the side here, there are some nice cutouts for cable management. And I just removed the glass panel from this side, and it lifts off the same way. It uses these little key slots spaced out around there. But what stands out here, and I kind of pointed it out a little bit earlier, a little bit hard to see behind the glass, but there is this, let's see, it looks like a bracket here, or a little clip, probably one down here. All right, so this probably swings open. Yep, there's a hinge there. So let's see if I can get this to open up. There we go. So there's one, and then two. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there's the controller for your RGB. And let's see, USB 3.0, SATA power. Okay, so what's nice here, if you look at these connectors, these are for your compatibility with your other RGB components. And then this, if I pull that off, that is probably, yeah, that's your connector there. And then you can connect that up to your motherboard on a motherboard that supports RGB if you want to go that route, so that all the cables fish through there. Let's see, there should be another, that was a male connection. Yeah, there's the female connection right there. And the shroud for, actually if you look over here, this panel here that sort of helps cover your cables to hide things for cable management. We've got these thumb screws here, so if you wanted to remove that completely, you can do that. And then we've got a couple of hard drive mounts here, and you can use your 2.5-inch drive or your larger 3.5-inch drive. So let's see how this works. Okay, so that's spring loaded. Ah, there we go. Okay, that's pretty clever. And you got these rubber isolators. And when you want to put it back on, you just sort of line up those little key slots with little tabs there, and it drops right in. And then you secure it. Now down here, you've actually got a little hard drive cage. So you can put a couple more 3.5-inch drives or your smaller solid state drives. And this is actually a metal tray. Most of the ones I've seen, in fact, this might be the first time I've ever seen a metal one. They're usually plastic. So that's nice. And then, let's see, it looks like this entire hard drive cage is removable. So if you want some extra space in front of your power supply to stash your cables, you have that option. Next, I believe there are a couple of screws that hold this front panel on. and I want to pop it off there and see what's going on behind it. And to get that panel off, there's a screw right in here. It's kind of hard to show, and then there's one down at the bottom. Where is it? Somewhere in here. Anyway, those are the screws. They're not very big. And after you take those screws out, this whole panel lifts up just like that. And I know in the instructions it says to be very careful. Oh, there we go. Because we have some wiring there. So you don't want to yank that front cover off too hard, or you'll have some wiring issues there. But anyway, that's how you get to the front filter panel. And it is a mesh panel with the usual magnet around the perimeter. Very similar to the one on top. But you can see there you can get 3 140 millimeter fans or 3 120 millimeter fans in there, or whatever combination of fans you want. And there's the very heavy mesh front section there where the fresh air is drawn in. And you can see there it gets pulled in from the bottom. This big gap right here. And we have a similar gap right there that should allow a fair amount of fresh air in. Now earlier I believe I referred to this as the power button and this as the reset button, because pretty much every case I've ever seen has a power and a reset button. However, in this particular case, this is indeed the power button right here, but this, even though it looks like it might be a reset button, it is actually the RGB button for the case lights. So we'll see how that functions here in a little bit, but I just wanted to make that quick correction. So I went ahead and took the screws out of the back so you can see that entire piece there can be removed. And that's the support for your graphics card. If you need a little extra help there, holding it up, and then I took the fasteners out for the pump bracket there too. So now you can see what the inside of the case looks like when all that is removed. Now I'll get this put back together and get the test system built up in it. Although, you know, since this case doesn't have any fans in the front and it just comes with the one single rear 120 millimeter exhaust fan, which is fine, but the amount of airflow through the case is really going to depend on what fans you pick and how many. Usually I just test a case with the fans that come from the factory, but with just a single fan, of course, you won't get very good results. So I went ahead and borrowed these 3 RGB fans. These are 120 millimeter fans. They're the Master Fan 120AB, and I actually borrowed them from the Master Liquid ML240L cooler, which is right there. Actually, I borrowed 2 from this cooler, and I have the ML120, and I took 1 fan from that, so I have a total of 3 fans. So I'm getting my test system all assembled here, and I popped the I/O panel in the back of the case as I always do, and got the motherboard in, and I thought, now wait a minute, something doesn't quite look right. There's about a ½ inch of clearance between my I/O panel and the I/O connections on the back of the motherboard. So I thought, oh boy, what did I mess up? Well, turns out I didn't mess anything up. They just leave, for whatever reason, about a ½ inch of clearance back here between the back of the motherboard I/O and the back of the case. And again, it's not really a problem, it's just different. So I'm going to pop that I/O panel out of there since it really can't be used that way. So there's what it looks like. Now, if you take into consideration, newer motherboards usually have the I/O panel as sort of an integrated heatsink that would look a little different there. It would fill in a lot of those gaps, but since this is an older motherboard before they started doing that, that's sort of what it looks like. Again, it's not a problem, it just looks a little different. And this motherboard here that I'm using for my testing is the old standard Z87 GD65. I'll be using the 4770K. Of course you can't see it there because the thermal paste needs to be cleaned up there from the last test, but I'll get that cleaned up, and I'm going to use the Noctua D14 as my test cooler. And again, for the RGB fans, I was going to use these from Cooler Master. I sort of borrowed them there from the ML240 and the ML120 since I needed 3 fans. The point here is to show off some RGB fans in an RGB case. Why not, right? And I was going to use these QL120s from Corsair, but they use a proprietary connector for the Corsair controller, which is fine. So that's sort of why I picked these from Cooler Master, because they use, let's see here, they use this type of connector there. The problem is, I didn't realize at first, these are actually 12-volt fans. So I wanted to use the onboard controller to sort of show them off. Problem is, this is a 5-volt output, and these are 12-volt fans, so they weren't really lighting up much, and you couldn't really change anything. So what I had to do is take the controller from the Master Air G100 there, which is this little guy here, and that since it connects to the Molex connector off the power supply, which supplies 12 volts, that means I can run these 12-volt fans. And I'm using the Cooler Master MWE 750 Gold power supply. And the way I'm powering them without using the motherboard, you can get one of these little jumpers here off of eBay for a couple bucks, and it's sort of, you can see there's a little loop there that makes it think that it is plugged into a motherboard, sort of tricks it there. That way you can turn the power supply on. But anyway, I'm going to use these fans here. And another thing to point out is these connectors here, you have to watch, because you see the little arrow there, that's what you line up with the opposing connectors, so it's always arrow to arrow. But it doesn't really tell you whether this is a 5-volt or a 12-volt system. And where you have to be careful, if you plug a 12-volt fan into a 5-volt source, the fan won't really care. Your LEDs just won't be very bright, and you probably won't have the ability to change colors, anything like that. So if you go, again, a 5-volt source into a 12-volt fan, not a big deal. The other way around, not really good, because you're running a 5-volt fan or a 5-volt RGB light strip, for example, into a 12-volt source, and you're going to overvolt it, and it may not survive that. So just make sure you know what voltage you've got between your RGB system and whatever item you're plugging into it. So for me, in this particular situation, I've got a 12-volt source here on this Molex connector, which goes into this 12-volt controller, again, that I borrowed from the Master Air G100M to control these 12-volt RGB fans. Normally, you would be using a fan that is rated at 5 volts to work on this onboard controller. And now that I have power to the case, I can show off the RGB here. And earlier, like I mentioned, I thought this was actually a reset button, but it's not. Usually the reset button's right next to the power button for the case, but this is actually your RGB control button, so you can sort of cycle through the different colors, and then at some point, yeah, you get a rainbow effect there. So you can see the light strip that runs along the front of that panel and sort of takes a quick angle at the bottom. And then the whole I/O section there is highlighted there with RGB lighting. And as I get ready to install the fans, I almost forgot to go over the hardware bag, as exciting as that is. Looks like it comes with a few zip ties, some rubber grommets for hard drive mounting, motherboard screws, fan screws, the usual array of hardware. And there I have all 3 of the donor fans in the system. Those are the 120mm Cooler Master fans. And again, I had to go through all this extra stuff because they are 12 volt. Well, all the fans are really 12 volt. It's the LED system for those fans that is 12 volt, and it would not work with this onboard 5-volt system. Again, you wouldn't normally have to go through any of this. I just wanted to throw these fans in the case. I could have used any fans, but took a little extra work, but I got them in there. So now I'm ready to finish buttoning the system up and start doing some testing. And getting the front panel on there is really pretty simple. I just have to line these little shoulder pins up with the key slots, and it'll drop in. Just make sure I don't pinch any wires, and then sort of find that sweet spot, top of the key slot, and then that drops right into position. Now, one thing to point out, if you look at these two screws, you can see they look rather similar from the top, but if we look at the threads themselves, you can see that one is a coarse pitch on the right, this guy here, and this one is a very fine pitch. And I have a lot of different screws laying around, and it's easy to get them mixed up. And the reason I say this is because this screw with the fine pitch is what came with the case. This is what you're supposed to use on the motherboard, because the studs in the motherboard tray have this particular fine thread cut into them. So if you try to use the wrong screw, you can easily cross thread. So just make sure you pay attention to which screws you're using to secure your motherboard. I forgot to put the magnetic filter here back in, so I had to pop the front back off, but that is not a big deal because it pops right back on. I got the Noctua D14 air cooler in there. Still got to get the second fan in. And then for the graphics card, I'm actually going to mount it here using these vertical slots. And to do that, you need to use one of these little cables. It's called the Flex VRC25. It's a PCI Express 3.0 by 16 riser kit. So it basically takes your PCIe slot on the motherboard and allows you to extend it out here so you can mount a card vertically. Alright, now if you want to use the vertical slots here, and I already loosened the screws up, but there's a plate that you sort of get out of the way, and I loosened the two screws up already, which allows you to remove the two knockouts out of the way. And I've already got the PCIe cable installed there, and again, that's from Fractal Design. That's the Flex VRC25. Corsair makes one. There are several manufacturers that make these PCIe cables. But I'll take the graphics card now and plug it into the cable, which is just like you do on the motherboard. Pop that in there. And on the bottom of the graphics card here, you got these two tabs, and those sort of plug in to a couple of slots there. And then you go ahead and screw it down just like you do on your normal slots that go horizontal back here. And you snug those up because the weight of this card is not too bad. It's not real heavy, so it doesn't want to droop much. So mounting it here just with those two screws is really sufficient for this particular card. And we'll pop this plate back in, and then attach the power cables. So there's one 6-pin. This is a GTX 770. And that's it. So it is all powered up, and it really looks nice. I think RGB fans there, or some sort of LED colored fan, is a definite must with this case. I like the way that honeycomb pattern sort of shines through there. Very nice. Now I'll kill the lights here in a minute because these things look a lot better when the lights are dimmed down a bit, and there's a glass on the back side of the case which I'm not used to. One thing I do want to kind of point out here, and you can definitely feel air being pulled in through these openings here, the vented sections. but it's a little sharp along these edges. It's kind of rough, like there's a burr rolled up. And for me, that's not really a problem, but if you had this case on the floor and you had a lot of small children, this is just begging for kids to put their hands in there. You can't get into the fans. The fans are all blocked off, but that sharp edge, they need to do a little better job at deburring the edges there, but that's really the only thing that stands out. Now the top cover also, I'm not sure for me how much I like this pattern here. I mean, it doesn't look bad, but honestly, I actually like when I take this panel off, if I can reach around there, pull that, I actually kind of like the look of the mesh a little better, but unfortunately you can't just take this top panel off because now you have those big holes there for locating the top panel. But that's really just a subjective sort of personal taste thing. I do like the way, if you don't put any fans on the top, I like the way you can easily access components there if you need to get in there to get something plugged in or unplugged or swapped out. An opening like that does make it a lot easier. So I'll get the lights dimmed and we can take a look at it in the dark. And that lighting effect there of the fans shining through that honeycomb pattern front grille, that really looks nice. And I like the LED strip across the front there, the RGB strip to be more precise. And the front fans, again, I think you definitely have to have some RGB fans there if you use this case. And the options are plentiful for what fans you want to use. And I think some fans up top there, of course it's too dark to see, but some fans at the top of the case would also look nice, as well as the rear exhaust fan, also in RGB. Now looking at the other side of the case here, even though it has glass, kind of spin it around, you can't see a whole lot. There's a little bit of light creeping through some of the openings. But anyway, I think this really looks nice. Now I am kind of limited as to what I can do with the RGB through the case controls, because you can link the controller from this case to an RGB compatible motherboard. Now the motherboard I'm using is older and does not have any of that, so you're limited to pushing the button here and changing the effects. So there's one. If I push it again, you get sort of a pastel, and then you can just go to solid color. So there's all red, there's green, actually this is shifting between colors now, there's blue, and they're much more vivid in person than what you're probably seeing through the camera or through the video here. So there's a fast pace chase effect. And I think this one, okay, this one is solid, so you can pick a solid color if you want. So there's red, green, blue, white, sort of a yellow or gold color, blue, sort of a pinkish or magenta, and then back to the rainbow. So again, if you have a compatible motherboard, the controller for the case here will plug into it, so you can sort of take advantage of the motherboard controls and integrate the RGB from the case with your motherboard. And one last thing I'll say about the case fans there. If you had the right type of case fan and plugged them into the RGB controller that's integrated with the case, then they would change and synchronize with the case RGB here. But like I said earlier, those case fans are just what I used, what I happen to have, and they're using that Cooler Master controller rather than the case. So anyway, enough about that. On to the thermal testing. What I'll do is just do an overclock at 4.2 gigahertz on my 4770K, crank up a little bit of heat and see what the temperatures are. I've used this motherboard, CPU, and cooler combination now for several years, so I have a pretty good idea of what temps I should see if I have decent airflow through the case, and I suspect as large as this case is, and with 3 fans pulling air in through the front, that I shouldn't see anything unusual. So I expect to see overclock temperatures with a load from Prime 95 at around 76, 78 C is usually what I see, and there we are, yeah, around 78, 77. So that's pretty standard there for this particular setup. So that just tells me that these 3 front 120 millimeter fans, they're running around 2000 RPMs, 2200. They're moving enough air through the case. And of course that depends on your ambient temperature, your room temperature, how many fans you've got running, and their locations. And these 3 in the front are cranked all the way up, along with the 2 fans on the Noctua D14 cooler and the 1 rear exhaust fan. And the fan noise is not bad. You can hear them, you can tell they're running, but it's not terrible. It's not obnoxious. Come around the back here, it's a little louder. But of course that's to be expected when you've got all the fans in the case maxed out. Alright, so wrapping this up, I'll just go over some of the features again that I like. The fact down here in the bottom you can get 2 2.5 inch drives or 2 3.5 inch drives. You also have these mounting brackets behind the motherboard. You can get 2 more 2.5 or 2 more 3.5 inch drives, so you can do any combination of those, but you can have a maximum of 4 drives. You can take this entire cage and tray system out altogether if you want more room to stash your cables. You got this nice cover here that also hides your cables, and of course when you have a glass back panel, as you do there, it's nice to cover your cables up, and this is removable if you don't want it. You've got the RGB system. Now this fan is shown here on the website, but this is not an included RGB fan. You have to supply any RGB fans yourself. And at first I was a little put off by that. I thought, what, a case with no front fans or top fans? Just a single rear? And now I see why. That gives you the ability to choose whatever fan combination you want, and that's not really a bad thing, so I'm okay with that. Radiator coverage. You've got really a lot of coverage there, up to a 360 millimeter radiator in the top or the front, which is good. Your fan coverage, again, you can put a couple of 140s at the top, or 3 140s or 3 120s in front if you like. And those are the main things that really stand out with this case. And I was looking around on Amazon, and Cougar does offer a line of RGB fans. Looks like right now you can get a set of 3 fans, and it looks like a remote controller, or the main controller and a little remote, for $69 right now. And checking out the Cougar website, there is a slightly different version. It's called the DarkBlader-S. What we have here today is the DarkBlader-G. Retail price is $139. I looked around on Amazon. I don't see it listed yet, but this case did just come out. And I'm pretty impressed with it, so I would give this the Overclockers Club Gold Award. I think for $139, it's a decent case, even if you have to buy a few fans. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.